Hello everyone and welcome. This will be sort of a different video from what we've been doing so far here at Alchemy Color. Today we're going to be doing a screen capture of the complete process of working with color negative film emulations in Lightroom and Photoshop. We're going to look into how to invert the negatives in Negative Lab Pro manually in Photoshop and also edit color in Lightroom. I'm going to be announcing 2 new films close to the end of the video and some other announcements for the future. So stay with us and let's dive into Lightroom here. We have these 5 photographs that can be used to exemplify what we can do with KODAK Gold200 emulation. I will choose this image here. And before applying the emulation, what you want to do first is to adjust exposure and white balance. This is super important because it really prepares the image for what's coming next. I go to my presets and I apply KODAK Gold200 negative. What you're looking at right now is your digital photograph emulated to KODAK Gold200 as the negative is seen under what I call the specialized method. So it's an end-to-end calibrated, highly rigorous method with archival quality, artwork reproduction techniques that allows me to extract the color of the negative as it's seen under the most system agnostic method possible. So this is applied over Adobe standards, Adobe standard being a standard that somewhat varies between cameras. You can expect some differences in the color reproduction, but nevertheless, it allows you to emulate the color negative at its most essential state, the developed film negative. You will encounter a series of colors already preset down here in the color mixer point color. These are set to high saturation colors and they basically compress out of gamut excursions from the original file. If you go up here to the mask sections, you have a series of optimization masks that further contribute to the film look. In the case of low resolution sensors, you can go to the film blur mask and reduce its amount. I would say any sensor below 10 megapixels will probably require some reduction in the film blur mask. So now it's time to export this file as a TIFF file. I will export it into the same folder as the original photo inside a subfolder called TIFF negatives, and I will add it to this catalog at the end. It's super important to set it to REC.2020. This is a wide gamut color space compatible with Negative Lab Pro and Photoshop, as we're going to see later in the video, and super important, 16 bits per channel. I go back to my grid view and I open the folder containing the negative exported from Lightroom. I open Negative Lab Pro. I will leave these settings by default. I'll choose the Frontier Film Scanner as simulation. You can also go for the Noritsu black and white, basic or none. I will leave presaturation by default, and there's no border buffer as this is the full frame image without any image or any bleed around the edge of the frame. So I will convert when negative. And from the onset, we have a pretty good looking image. I will adjust white balance first. I will select soft highlights to retain some more highlight information. I will increase contrast. And I will go down here to go to the lab simulation. So this is basically a LUT applied over the file that simulates a lab scan. I will increase saturation by 1 click. And I will leave the image as is. Negative Lab Pro was lucky with this image, let's put it that way, because it has the content that allows it to do its automatic film-based subtraction and white balance with ease. You may encounter images that look easy from the beginning, but Negative Lab Pro has a hard time making it look natural. So what you would do in that case is copy the settings from a natural looking image, such as this one, onto the hard to invert image, and then there are some adjustments that can be done on top, as we'll see in a minute. Negative Lab Pro is limited to what can be done inside the plugin, as the develop panel works behind the inversion. Any changes to exposure, color, contrast, whatever, will affect the precision of the inversion previously made by Negative Light Pro. So let's look into a way of achieving edits on the positive image. Negative Light Pro works with curves to set the neutral film base, exposure and contrast. It works with the calibration panel to set to complement the emulation made with profiles, as you can see up here. You can choose to change these profiles if you want. It comes with a folder and containing a series of emulations, in this case the Frontier Film Scanner, and you can change these after inverting the image. But editing inside of the develop panel is more or less forbidden. Let's say if I change exposure, contrast, or white balance, I get an unbalanced image. But there is a way to edit the positive image. I go to masks, choose range, luminance range, and I click at either end of the luminance range selector. This way I'm selecting the entire picture. If I go down here to the point color, eyedropper, and select the sky, you can see that we selected the clear blue sky and we're effectively working on the positive image. I can now adjust saturation and hue and work directly on the positive image. So here is a look that I think is reminiscent of what people are familiar with when working with KODAK Gold 200. It's a warm tint distributed all over the image, especially in the oranges and yellows. The sky is preserved in its natural cyan, very bright actually. And the image is fairly neutral with some, let's say, gold added to it. That is the marketing of the film, and it really translates into its color response. If I zoom in to the image here, you can see this analog looking grain that was created in the negative emulation step. So you have during the raw file, if we go back here, you have color noise reduction set to 0. And this, in combination with the masks that we saw before, namely the film grain and the blur mask, creates a type of grain that is really reminiscent of film, especially after being inverted with Negative Light Pro or in Photoshop, as we're going to see later in this video. Here I used Alchemy Color Negative Film Emulations, namely KODAK Gold 200, in combination with Negative Light Pro to arrive at an image that really looks like scanned analog film. So you have a lot of ways of tweaking color inside of Negative Light Pro that could potentially make KODAK Gold look like some other film stock, but here I tried to edit color in a way that's reminiscent of what is commonly associated with this specific film. Oranges and yellows, very bright, very saturated. A neutral presentation, kind of bright with neutral skies, let's call them. Now let's apply this same emulation to every other image inside this folder. I deselect the image that I just exported, and I export the other 4 files as TIFFs. I navigate to the folder containing the TIFF files, and now let's copy the settings that I created with Negative Light Pro for this image to the other images. As you can see, not every image reacts the way that we expect. For example, this image here looks extremely saturated. We could potentially correct that with the point color adjustment with a mask that operates, as we saw, over the positive image, not the negative. And we can tame this high saturation and make it look more balanced. You can also work with curves over the positive image. And what this does is that it allows us to also edit white balance, where you're basically drawing curves that change white balance in more or less the same manner as the white balance slider would do in the positive image. So there you have it. So this was Negative Lab Pro. Now let's look at a way of inverting this image in Photoshop. I drag this image onto Photoshop. Notice that Photoshop didn't ask me about the color space mismatch, as I've set the working color space to REC.2020 before I imported this image. So if Photoshop asks you about a color space mismatch, preserve REC.2020. Don't convert it to REC to sRGB or any other working color space that you have set at the moment. So the first step is to import a series of Photoshop actions that we're going to use to invert this image. So let's go to Chrome, go to my GitHub repository. It's Alchemy Color Negative Inversion. It's set to public. I go to this green button up here and download everything as a zip file. I save it to downloads. I unzip the file, and I have all the necessary materials to work with. Let's start by importing Photoshop actions into Photoshop. I go to Load Actions. I go to folder 2, Reversing the Negative, Photoshop Actions, Color Negative Inversion. Let's select action number 1. I run the action. You can pause the video here if you want to read these instructions. I press continue. What I will do now is look for a known neutral, dark and bright area of my image. I know for a fact that this area under this step and this bright illuminated area of snow here correspond to a neutral, dark and bright areas of the image. So let's go back to Photoshop. I will zoom into this area here. I will select the eyedropper tool and I will Option or Alt click on the dark area, which in the negative is bright. I release the Option key and I click on this bright area, which in the negative is a dark area because we're looking at the negative. Now it's time to run the density balance script. This is a script that neutralizes the film base. I select action number 2, I run the action, and Photoshop asks me to locate densitybalance.js script. I go to Downloads, Reversing the Negative, Density Balance Script, densitybalance.js. Now I have two options. I have 3.1, Negative Inversion and Edit in Photoshop, and Negative Inversion in Photoshop and Edit in Lightroom. I'll select the first one. Photoshop asks me to load a template containing all the necessary layers to invert this image. I press continue. I go to Reversing the Negative, Negative Reversal Template, and I select the first one. You can pause the video here to read these instructions. And I press continue. Notice how much more neutral this image is in comparison to the inversion made in Negative Lab Pro. Negative Lab Pro is tweaked to look more like the printing process, the chemical RA4 printing process, whereas this method in Photoshop is more neutral, more technical. But there are still tweaks that we can do inside of Photoshop, so let's look into that. You can adjust exposure by setting values inside the exposure layer. Gamma correction adjusts the midtones. And above these technical layers, you have color editing. This group here allows you to change the white balance. I will pick the gray point sampling tool and pick this bluish white. The image immediately warms up. I can adjust the quantity by setting the amount of opacity in this layer. I can add new layers if I want. For example, saturation. and I can adjust contrast at the end. I will save this as a new image. There is also a way of inverting the image in Photoshop and doing all of the color edits in Lightroom or any other external program. Previously, we selected Action 3.1, negative inversion and edit in Photoshop. Now we're going to run Action 3.2, but we have to reverse some steps that we just made in order to make this work. So I will simply delete the negative reversal and color editing groups and run Action 3.2. Photoshop asks me to load the template. I load the template, and here you have it, a positive image, flat, without any sort of contrast added, that I will save as a new file. Inverted in Photoshop, edited in Lightroom. I go back to Lightroom, and I synchronize this folder. Lightroom detects two more images that I can organize as such. We have inversion made in Negative Lab Pro, inversion made in Photoshop, and edit in Photoshop, inversion made in Photoshop, and color that we're now going to edit in Lightroom. This is a very flat image that is a positive that can be edited to taste in Lightroom. White balance in particular is more accurate in Photoshop when you're working with a 32-bit image. But in any case, if you want to work with a large set of emulations, you can simply export these flat positives from Photoshop and edit the color directly in Lightroom. There is also a fourth option. Let's say that you want to transform all the edits made in Photoshop into an XMP profile that you can apply directly on top of the exported TIFF negatives. So let's go into Photoshop again. I go to Actions and select action number 5. I run action number 5, and Photoshop asks me to locate neutral_64.png. A HALT file is a very smart way of retrieving color transformations in any color editing system. In this case, we're going to capture all of the transformations made by these layers in Photoshop and then transform these into a cube file. I press Continue, go to Downloads, go to Extraction, extract negative conversion, and then select neutral_64.png. Photoshop asks me to save a new file with these colors applied with a new file name. And I simply add gold 200 #1. Now I have a message telling me to convert this HALT file into a cube by going to this website. I go to Chrome. I click on Convert to Cube. I select the PNG image we just created, and this website will create a cube lookup table for us. I will call it gold 200 #1. Now let's create an XMP profile in Photoshop. I select the background image, go to Filter, Camera Raw Filter, go to Presets, and then I Option or Alt click on Create New Preset. This allows me to create a profile. First thing, I click on Color Lookup Table. I select KODAK Gold 200.cube that we just created. I change the color space to REC.2020, and I set the amounts to 100, 100, 100. I will name this profile Gold 200 #1. I can close this dialog, go to Lightroom, I select a negative image, create a virtual copy, I reset, every setting. So I go back to the original emulated negative and I restart Lightroom. I go into the Develop panel, go to Profile Browser and select KODAK Gold200 #1. Just as before, this emulation is working after the Develop panel, so naturally any changes to the Develop panel will affect the color balance. If you want to make any color specific settings, choose luminance range, the entire luminance range, point color, and make your edits to taste. You can also change curves, and if you go into the RGB curves, you can set your own manual white balance. So this is a possible approach to solving the problem of inverting the color negative film. But as we described in the previous video, there's also the specialized method. The negative emulation that you just saw is a way of transporting the color of this specialized method into a digital file. But there's also the possibility of directly emulating what the negative film looks like when inverted under the specialized method. This method is even more system agnostic in the way that it really extracts the true color of film, overlooking the potential distortions of the system itself. The color space used is different from REC.2020. The whole process is extremely tweaked to the point where you can have negative film look even more accurate than a digital photograph. With that in mind, it was possible to extract the nuanced look of color negative films, in this case KODAK Gold200, and apply it directly on the positive image in your digital photographs. So let's look into that. I go back to the folder containing all of my raw files. I reset settings, go into the Develop panel, open presets, and select KODAK Gold200 paper. What you have here is a very subtle color transformation that transports the look of KODAK Gold200 as it was seen under the specialized method. The process itself is way cleaner, way more faithful, but regardless of the subtlety, all of this can be amplified because now we are working with the direct positive. So any adjustment in the Develop panel will be reflected by the emulation. You can also go to the amount slider up here and increase the amount past 100%. A series of optimization masks have been added alongside the preset. You can tweak these to taste. I'll go to sky recovery, for example, and I will increase the saturation in the sky and change its hue. These positive emulations come in three flavors. You have KODAK Gold200 paper, which emulates the contrast introduced by KODAK Endura printing paper. You have ACR that basically adds film color without changing the tone curve of Adobe Standard. And you have linear that reverses the tone curve of Adobe Standard, thus making the image pseudo-linear. And we can see the effect of those by changing them in the profile browser. And today we're also releasing two new films, KODAK Ultramax 400 and KODAK PORTRA 400. With KODAK Ultramax 400, you get a denser, more brownish version of a KODAK Gold 200. The images that you're looking at right now are negative emulations inverted in Negative Lab Pro. And also KODAK PORTRA 400. PORTRA 400 is more of a neutral film with a slight hint of teal in the lower and mid tones, but overall very neutral and highly malleable in post-production. The images that we're looking at right now are emulated negatives inverted in Negative Lab Pro. We can go into the raw files, select a raw file, and apply the positive emulation. Naturally, it requires some more tweaking, but with enough time and effort, these can be approximated to the results that come out of Negative Lab Pro. How do these film emulations compare to real film scans? I shot KODAK PORTRA 400 alongside a digital camera, the same scene, same circumstances, same lens, inverted the negative film under the specialized method, and compared it with digital photographs with the positive emulations applied. So let's look at some images. And there you have it. I hope that this video was useful. If you want to see any of your images processed with these methods, send me some raw files. I will get back to you with negative emulations, negative inverted in Negative Lab Pro or Photoshop, or direct positive emulations. We'll be having new products coming out in the future, namely KODAK Ektachrome direct positive emulation, and also something specific for Canon cameras. We're going to be bringing the film simulations from a Fujifilm X100VI to any Canon camera that supports picture styles. So we'll be able to photograph Velvia, Provia, Astia with a Canon camera directly for JPEG. So it's a straight out of the camera JPEG process that opens the doors for recipes for Canon cameras, etc. So if you have any questions, leave them down in the comments. If you like this sort of format and want to see something else some other issue covered with the same format of video, just let me know. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.